Could you imagine if tipping was against the law? Well, in 1909, Washington became the first state in the U.S. to outlaw tipping. Now, tipping culture has been normalized and is often expected. But what if it were to be rolled out once again? If customers got to keep the extra tip money and workers earned a higher wage, would they enjoy the service just as much, or would it have an impact on the effort put in by servers? In this podcast, I will be discussing the history of tipping culture and why it sparks so much controversy. I mentioned tipping was first banned in 1909 by the state of Washington. However, tipping didn't start as an American tradition. It was actually a European practice where wealthy aristocrats would give their servants small coins. This practice was imported to America after the Civil War, and many reformers at the time believed it clashed with America's democratic ideals. One of which was William R. Scott, who wrote The Itching Palm, the study of the habit of tipping in America, in 1916 as a way of arguing that tipping was un-American. He believed that the aristocratic traditions imported from Europe had carried a sense of social hierarchy that opposed the values of equality and fostered submissive behavior from those who were not wealthy. Scott's rhetoric was often used to dramatize the problem. He said that the vice of tipping is not only un-American, it is anti-American. It is a cancer in the breast of democracy, a leprosy in the body politic. Middle-class reformers who agreed with him believed that tipping was a symbol of wealth holding power over workers, and for the workers often meant low base wages and the dependence of unpredictable gratuities. This led to active state-level crusades, with several legislatures briefly passing anti-tipping laws. Although Scott viewed tipping as un-American, the modern economists such as Ofer Azar argue something much different. In his journal article, The Economics of Tipping, Azar argues that people tip out of social norm, not social hierarchy. More often than not, we tip out of guilt, out of desire to be fair, or even to protect our reputation. Both arguments represent the idea that tipping is more than just spare change added to your restaurant bill. It reflects how we think about fairness, dignity, and obligation. As you can see, for Scott and other reformers, tipping was more than a bad practice. It was a social disease. In the midst of a progressive era, a period of widespread social and political reform, they tried to create legislative action in order to stop this disease. Several states, starting with Washington, passed the anti-tipping laws that made it a crime to give or accept gratuity, and gave fines or even jail time as punishment. They thought that if tipping encouraged inequality and hierarchy, then banning it would force employers to pay fair wages and restore dignity in the workers. As historian Carrie Seagrave adds in his book, Tipping: An American Social History of Gratuities, other states soon followed Washington's lead, including Iowa, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Newspapers at the time ran headlines about these anti-tipping crusades, often celebrating them as a victory for the working man and a rejection of un-American traditions. Unfortunately, enforcing this ban was more difficult than it was cut out to be. As people continued to tip in secret and wages were not lowered, so workers still depended on the tips to make ends meet. By 1913, Washington repealed this ban, and the other states reluctantly did the same. But as Azar points out, this makes sense because tipping is deeply embedded in social behavior, as the psychological pressure to tip was stronger than any law on the books. After anti-tipping movement failed, the practice became more and more entrenched in the American culture. However, the debate over fair wages for workers never went away, and by the late 1930s, reformers shifted their focus from the states to the federal government in order to spark change. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, a landmark piece of legislation that created the first national minimum wage. But this is where tipped workers like restaurant servers, hotel staff, and barbers were left in a gray area. The law still did not guarantee protection for these workers because employers continued to rely on tips to cover much of their staff's income. It wasn't until almost 30 years later, in 1966, Congress introduced what is now known as the tip credit. This amendment essentially created a two-tier wage system where employers can pay tipped workers less than the federal minimum wage as long as their tips made the difference. This seemed like a balance between business costs and worker earnings. However, it shifted the responsibility for paying fair wages away from employers and onto customers. Seagrave also illustrates in his book that the mid-20th century debates over tipping really just revealed how divided the public had become. While some saw the new minimum wage as progress, others were worried that tipped employees being excluded worsened the inequality. Civic journalism at the time reflected the tension. The book cites a New York Times editorial from 1946 that complains tipping places the server in the humiliating position of having to cringe before the customer. Furthermore, Azar helps explain why tipping had become a part of the wage system and why this compromise persisted. In his article, he essentially stated that employers knew how to play the game. They knew that tipping was less driven by logic and more by social norm. If customers were already conditioned to tip, then the tip credit allows for the incentive to keep wages low and let customers carry the weight of being a major source of income for the large demographic of people. By the 1960s, tipping was pretty much legally protected. Keep in mind that this started as a European custom that was rejected by reformers such as William Scott, and since then had turned into a major part of the American wage system. This doesn't mean that the topic wasn't controversial anymore, however. People started to question the fact that a lot of other countries do not rely on customers to subsidize wages like the US does. What does tipping culture look like now with the rise of digital payments and tipflation? Today, tipping in the United States looks a lot different from the rest of the world. Even though it originated from Europe, the practice is not considered normal or expected to the same degree. Researchers Michael Lynn, George Zinkin, and Judy Harris conducted a cross-country study of consumer tipping and found that the U.S. is an outlier. In many countries, it is acceptable to just leave coins on a table, round up, or not tip at all. In fact, in some countries like Japan, it is actually considered rude to tip. But in the U.S., tipping is not only expected, but largely built into the economies of the service industry. This can be understood when looking at cultural values in America, such as individualism and orientation to authority. The idea of tipflation, as a 2024 Washington Post feature reported, involves digital tip screens and preset percentages that have spread tipping far beyond restaurants and bars, and is now seen at coffee shops and takeout counters. Nowadays, even if you manually type in your order using a self-checkout kiosk, there is still a page at the end that prompts customers to add 20% or more. Although this keeps wages lower for employees in the service industry, and most particularly in the restaurant industry, some tipped workers like bartenders and servers in fine dining or busy city bars can earn far more than others, even though the effort and the hours are the same. This now seems to be leading to an uneven distribution of income. Scott feared tipping imported aristocracy, but America could not get rid of it, and today it's more pervasive than he could ever have imagined. What began as an aristocratic custom has evolved into a deeply ingrained social norm that shapes how service work is valued and who carries the responsibility for paying workers. Looking at its history helps us see that tipping is not just about coins or percentages on a screen, but about what we believe workers deserve, and dignity in pay. As their culture continues to shift, the question remains, should tipping continue to be the backbone of service work, or is it time to imagine something different?